Hello, Caroline, and welcome very much to the Inner Goddess Summit today.
Thank you, Bonnie.
You're welcome. And so you and I have been having some very interesting conversations, some very thought-provoking conversations. So I really am excited to talk to you today and get a little deeper into some of the things we've just sort of touched on in our previous conversations. But let me just ask you, first of all, how would you like to start off this conversation today?
Well, thank you for bringing me here. I'm so honored. I'd like to just start out with a short invocation because this is all in service. We both know that we are in service, in commission to a higher force field, to divinity, to bringing peace, clarity, ascended information, high frequency. And so I'd like to invoke the presence of the divine feminine and the divine masculine. They work in cohorted. So Holy Divine Mother, Holy Divine Father, Holy Divine Other, and that which has no name. Thank you for this opportunity to be in service to the divine in all these forms and places, and everybody that's here now and will come through. May they receive your blessing. May they receive the information that will guide them to their highest place in their consciousness. Thank you for this opportunity. With great love, thank you. Blessed be.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Caroline. It's always so nice to just take a moment, whatever we're doing, to stop and tune in to the divine and give gratitude. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
I would like, first of all, to just begin a little bit with, I know because I've been talking to you that you have so much information about so many goddesses, but how did you come into this knowledge?
You know, thanks for asking. I think that we are always being courted by the divine. The divine is always trying to catch our attention. And it's when we take the time to listen, or acknowledge, our natural, I think it's natural for humans to be in a place of reverence, awe, and curiosity, and open to love. That is our natural state. And the divine will come in various ways to speak to us. So my path with a goddess started at a young age with a fascination of one goddess. And I like to guide people in their practice of learning about goddesses to who their first introduction, it was interesting, the door just flew open. Who were they first introduced in the pantheon of the divine ones? Who was the first one that caught their attention, maybe as a 6-year-old or a teenager? Because those often are the divine beings who are almost archetypal. And it may have come through a book of myth, it may have come through being at a performance or a story or a movie, but that is when the journey started for me. And mine was with Persephone, and she actually became my archetypal goddess. 6 years ago, I was working in wax, and here comes the door again, sorry. Well, here they are, coming in and out. That door closed. They're coming in and out, hello. I was working in wax, and a form came through wax, and I was working on a project to cast bronze, and a form came through, and I didn't know what the form was. And so I said, what is this? And they said, oh, it's a woman's ceremonial knife. And I just paused. I didn't really understand what that meant. So I had to do a little research on the history of women's knives. And the history of women's knives goes back thousands and thousands of years. It takes a lot of work to make a knife, to make something out of metal. And they were beings. There was a lot of level of animism around people's knives. They would name their knives. These knives had a persona, had a presence, because they would only have one knife, and they would hand that knife on to their daughter or their son. And this was so fascinating. And I was told that this knife was named Gaia for the Mother Earth. And it was a knife to anchor down the divine energy, bringing divine energy down into earth, a cross. We've got a cross in there. It's for anchoring, and it also has an anchor form in it. And hooks to do invocation of beings In the other realms, a knife to cut cords. And so this was the start of me creating talismans that would work with particular divine feminine energies and beings. I now work with a whole pantheon of goddesses. I'm in commission with them to create talismans that will be used to align people to their spiritual energy and presence.
That's fascinating. And so you said you were working with wax, and so then you're an artist. So you were working with wax, and wax is a part of the process of this metal work that you do?
So lost wax, bronze casting, is one of the oldest forms of metalworking. It's when the Bronze Age was formed. This is the same practice they did 6,000 years ago in the Bronze Age. So this is actually a practice that ties to our ancestral lineage, all of us, for the Bronze Age. So back then and now, you take wax, you create a form. It's very soft. It's an interesting process because you're working with something so feminine and malleable. And then you create a mold around that wax, well, melt that out, and then pour in metal that is as hot as liquid. It becomes white, bright white milk, and you pour that into the mold, and it cools and gives you a bronze form, a metallic form. It moves through so many alchemies that are both feminine and masculine. It's watery, and then it's fiery, and then it's hard. It's a very interesting practice to engage with the elements. Yeah.
It's a really fascinating practice and quite in depth, it sounds like.
Yeah, it's pretty, yeah. It is. I was drawn to the practice because the deities at that time, when I started to research this process, and when this knife came through, I had been noticing that there was a particular hunger in the European lineages to know our own ancestral indigenous roots. And there did not seem to be many tools that were still around, spiritual tools, for those of European lineages. There were tools from Tibetan monasteries and Buddhist monasteries, and tools that were coming out of indigenous traditions that are still very alive and producing tools. But I felt the need to create tools that would tie to my ancestors, the deities and the indigenous intelligence and indigenous spiritual practices of my ancestors. So using a process that my ancestors would have followed to tie to a deity that my ancestors would have known was kind of creating a big hoop that would hold my consciousness and my practice and activate some very strong ley lines to my own ancestral indigenous roots. Yeah.
And so why do you feel that it's important to connect to the deities of your ancestral roots?
Good question. Our consciousness is not defined by time and place. Our consciousness is something outside of that, yet our DNA has been tied in time and place. And these two forces are coming to merge. And when you are tied to your own, when we look at cultures where the ancestral spiritual practices are intact, there's a sort of a coherency, a lineage of, a child who received a mantra from her mother, and that mother received the mantra from her mother, and there's a kind of clarity of, and we're really drawn, as Europeans, we're really drawn to this because we know that we had that at one point. Everyone in America arrived here at some point under some sort of duress, political or spiritual or religious or enslavement. And we were torn out of our ancestral spiritual ley lines, and we left them. And there's kind of a hole in our being, in our understanding of how deeply we are connected to divinity when we have left those practices behind. I'm not saying this is for everyone. There are some people who have very strong relationships to their land and they've developed them and they don't feel this absence, but many of us do. And I think that if we find ourselves drawn to indigenous practices, it's because we are looking for, what does that look like? This clear, coherent, hand down. So this is a way of activating, since we're not bound by time and space, we actually can go back and receive that kind of transmission through our grandmothers when we engage in that way. So does that make sense?
It does make sense. And you just used a word that I find I find interesting because the word indigenous, because I know for me, and I've recently started sort of rethinking or examining this idea, the word indigenous. For me, and I think for a lot of people, when we say the word indigenous, it brings to mind like Native Americans or the natives who lived in South America, or, you know, those type of things. And we sort of forget, I think, that Europe also has its indigenous peoples and its indigenous ways. And that so many of us are connected to that through our DNA, through our blood lineage. So that's, I'm glad you used that word, because I think it's sort of important to remember when we say indigenous, it doesn't necessarily mean, you know, brown people who lived in America, in the Americas, when they were discovered by Europeans.
Yeah, I think that we're drawn to active, alive, maintained indigenous cultures, and there's this, you know, level of not appropriating the things that they have, that has been so carefully, you know, carried from generation to generation, that's being preserved. They've preserved it, and the appropriating of that is, it's just not right. It's, you know, it's, we need to find where our roots lay, where are our indigenous roots. And the truth is that in Europe, you know, 6,000 years ago, the indigenous roots of Europeans all across Europe, everywhere in the world, actually, there were relationships to the land, to the sky, to the water, to the elements, to the animals, to the plants that were essential for survival. So there was no people that didn't develop these relationships. But as populations came to the US and things have moved very quickly, or to the Americas, or things have just moved very quick. If you live in a technologically advanced era, you may have been cut off from these old, very supportive, very wise relationships that your ancestors maintained for their survival. And all the deities that I work with are related to an element. You know, this is creating a relationship to a deity or a goddess is not about worshiping and honoring. It's about creating a relationship in a multidimensional realm that will facilitate your presence, which is a multidimensional presence. So those roots, you know, we're very drawn when we see people with this maintained information, this knowledge, this gnosis about their relationship to their environment and their community and their spiritual life. They have a very strong sense of belonging. And I think that when we create relationships to the deities of our ancestors, you know, the deities of the earth, the deities of the sky, the deities of rain, we will find that we are reawakening our sense of belonging to the earth. And right now, that's a really critical dimension of whether we're going to survive as a species. You know, how deeply do we sense our belonging here?
So my mind is just digesting and rolling around everything you've said. So I'm thinking about you as an artist and just sort of discovering, you know, this form coming through, and then you starting to ask and wonder, what is this? And then researching deeper and learning more and getting deeper into your own lineage from European roots. So could you give us some goddesses that you have gotten in touch with from your lineage?
Sure. So Gaia, that was the first. Gaia, she represents the earth, and that's a Greek word, but it was such a familiar word for the consciousness of the earth. So it's Gaia, and then came along Brigid, and Brigid is one of the bridge goddesses. She has been around, at least there's reference to her in Northern Europe, written in rune, carved into stones, 6,000 years. And she somehow managed to shapeshift. I work with a lot of shapeshifting goddesses. So she went from being a Northern European earth goddess to becoming a Christian saint. So these deities, when I talk about them, to me, deities, the goddesses, are beings, actual beings that don't have form, but they are part of the earth's evolutionary process. They are also evolving. And the fact that they've stayed in human consciousness in the noosphere for thousands and thousands of years, like we haven't forgotten their name or what they represent, it means that they are activating their presence. They want to be here for this grand showdown. So Brigid, anyways, went from being a goddess to being a saint, Saint Brigid. So she was able to ride through many of the deities, the ancient Celtic and Nordic deities were lost, but Brigid managed to arrive through becoming a saint. And yet what she represented, even though it slightly started to shift, her presence was still within, human thought and place in noosphere. So Brigid, she's goddess of fire, healing, metal arts. She's my overlighting goddess and wordcraft. And let's see, we've got Balder. So this is a Nordic god that I've created a piece for the divine masculine. He's one of the last, well, no, actually I've made him a long time ago, but the divine feminine won't find her place fully embodied if the divine masculine's not there. And the divine masculine is an aspect that is in all people, just like the divine feminine is. This is not a gender story. Divinities is not dual. It's not binary. It's not even gender associated, but we've created those words to explain these opposing forces or complementary forces of creation on this planet, or maybe this Milky Way, but it could be very different other places. But anyway, so Balder, a Nordic solar deity. Freya, also a Nordic deity. Also an old goddess who's traveled for a long time. And a lot of these old goddesses, these bridge goddesses that traveled before Christianity and are still here, or they traveled from a time when there was a matriarchal religious belief system, and now we're in a patriarchal religious belief system, but somehow they managed to stay. She's a goddess who has been deeply misunderstood, and her identity's been inverted. And that's sometimes how the goddess could kind of remain, as she allowed herself to be kind of alchemized and transformed and given a terrible name, but at least she stayed. And Lilith, she also is one. She's been around, at least the early references, back in Sumeria and Mesopotamia. This is a very old goddess. She's been very present in Christian Judeo mythology and biblical stories, but her true nature is quite different. We've got a lunar goddess. This is for the new moon. Just about every culture has a lunar goddess or lunar god, but often she's a deity, a goddess. The deity is a goddess. Each of these tools have ways of working. There's encodements and ways to work with them. It's this too has that kind of cutting edge for clearing things. And then I have these two deities. This is Isis and Nephthys. And Isis and Nephthys would seem to be an anomaly for a European woman. And I felt that way, but they kept appearing and talking to me. And as I looked more deeply into it, the temples of Isis traveled into Europe thousands of years before Christianity. Isis was a very powerful deity, and it's been said that Jesus was brought up by two priestesses of the Temple of Isis, Mother Mary and Mary Magdalene. And having Christian ancestors and ancestors with the name Magdalene, it made me really look double to see, if their names were thousands of years old and they were using Magdalene as a name. What did they know? What were they encoding in their daughter? What information were they giving? So with great honor, I offer these two, Isis and Nephthys, the younger sister of Isis, and they're related to the solar systems of Sirius A and Sirius B. So they're both earthly and galactic tied.
Interesting. I want to back up for a second, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Just before Lilith, did you say Fran?
Freya.
Freya.
Yeah, Freya.
Yeah, Freya.
She's pretty fierce. This is a rainbow warrior. I have a few Freyas, but Freya is a death goddess, and she accompanies the processes around transitioning from this realm to the next.
And when you say she was inverted, what does that mean?
Oh, inverted. Oh, so people think of Freya being just a goddess of sex and love and very lustful. But actually, Freya, as you get to know her, all these goddesses can be met and you can converse with them outside of literature, through devotional practices, and listening. But she's considered to be a goddess of, sex and lust. But in truth, as you get to meet her, you realize that she actually she is a goddess of discretion and assimilation and protection. And her story is, a bit twisted. It's not that she slept with everybody, it's that she didn't sleep with everybody. And so the narratives were twisted around. So yeah, a lot of the goddesses.
How many times has that been repeated in history, right?
Yeah.
I mean, how many women have gone through that? They didn't sleep with anyone, but they got inverted into, being the most promiscuous girl in town.
Yes. I mean, the divine feminine, if we look back 13,000 years ago, that was a matriarchal religious era. I'm not saying that it was a perfect era and that women were perfect, but from that time, we are now in a patriarchal religious era. And in order to have that big shift over 13,000 years from believing that the feminine is holy to, oh, no, it's not. Oh, only the masculine is holy and divine. You're going to have to do a lot of twisting the stories about the divine feminine in order for the masculine to take place. And I believe we're in the beginning of a new stage where it's, maybe not, I actually think it will be the divine feminine, divine masculine. That's the next era we're going to go through. And then there may be a dissolution of feminine and masculine. It might be the divine other. What really is divinity is beyond that binary system. So, we're in a great turning on many levels, both in our spiritual perception, our economic, our social, our religious. There's so many shifts that are taking place, but this perception of how divinity is perceived and known is in a shift also.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That makes sense. And so you brought up one that I must go there, because I know I don't personally know really anything about almost any goddess. This is so much new information for me, but I do know I have heard Lilith as being a very controversial one. Can you talk about who is Lilith?
Oh, yes, Lilith. Lilith is very controversial, and it's to watch Lilith, to watch the narrative, to study the narrative of Lilith. So this form is based on the astrological symbol of dark moon Lilith, or Ceres, the asteroid. But I was excited when I created this form because this is the form that when I do my energy center clearing or your chakra clearings, where you cut the cords around your chakras in order to kind of maintain your energetic sovereignty, I always used a blade like this to cut around. So when I made this, I was like, oh, this is great. Now I have a representation of this tool that I use in these subtle realms, in the astral realms. So Lilith, and yeah, it's so interesting to receive these contracts from these goddesses to make something for them. And I actually held off for a few years. I made this in wax and I didn't cast it for a few years because when I work with the deity, when I'm working with the knives, I have to be engaged with the deity. And it was so powerful and so intense that I just kept her over there and didn't work with her. Same with several of the goddesses, sat there for a few years in wax before I ever cast them. So Lilith is one of the true bridge goddesses, in that she has traveled from a time of when it was the matriarchal religious structure into the patriarchal religious structure. And she, if we go back just to where her strongest narrative is being told in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And if we go back before that, the roots of that, the first Lilith is associated with being one of the first creation beings. There were two creation beings. There was a masculine creation being and a feminine creation being. And the feminine creation being was Lilith. And in the Judeo-Christian narrative, Lilith was Adam's first wife. And she would not sublimate herself to Adam's, they say, sexual postures, but it's really much greater than that. And so she was banned from the garden. Lilith, though, before she went down into the garden, she was the consort of God. She was the feminine consort of the masculine. And so here she came down, the divine feminine. It's just interesting to look at these narratives. The divine feminine came down to engage with the mortal realm, while the divine masculine stayed out above in another realm, and the divine feminine came down. So just that's a first clue as to, like, these early writers of these sacred narratives, whether we agree with them or not, they were trying to tell some stories that would travel through time. If you want to talk to someone next to you, you can whisper. Across the room, you shout. If you want something to travel for thousands of years, you want a story, you put it into mythology. Myth, the stories we tell through myth are the ways that we will perceive our reality. So anyways, why did they have a divine feminine like living with a mortal? So, and in any case, she was banned out of the garden. She was kicked out because she wouldn't sublimate herself to Adam, to the mortal. And Adam went to God, the creator, and said, I'm a little lonely here. Can you bring Lilith back? And God sent 3 angels down to invite Lilith to return to the garden, and she didn't, which is also interesting. So you think about, like, why is the divine feminine here? But, is it something that we have to invoke, or is it something, it's interwoven into everything? So the masculine God creator, his cohort was staying down on earth, embodied in earth now over at the Red Sea, according to the mythology. And God created another feminine from the rib of Adam and gave him Eve. And Eve was a virgin. She was a child. She was a young girl. She knew nothing of the world. And the mythology continues to say that, Lilith was the snake that seduced Eve to eat the apple, the knowledge, gain the ability to have children, sex, all these things. And Adam had a choice whether he would eat the apple or not, and Adam chose to eat the apple. So so Lilith, though, was at one point a very powerful creator, goddess, and she would bless life. She was known to be a power. And then over time, over thousands of years, and particularly when the craft of writing came in and stories started to be written, and it happened to be men that were writing the stories, the story of Lilith was changed, altered, till she became associated with some very dark energies of prostitution and eating babies and seduction. And she, in a sense, fell from grace, but Lilith is still here waiting to be. She's like, hey, does anyone know the real story? Hey, come on over if you want to know the real story. She actually represents, in my cosmology, everybody will have a different relationship, but she has shown me that to invoke Lilith is to invoke the reigniting and the realignment and reacquaintance with divinity in form. And she works with me at the lowest chakra, at the base chakra, our relationship to the earth. And because one of the greatest sort of illusions, delusions, chainings of our consciousness has been to separate our consciousness and our perception of our relationship to the earth as a divine being. And we've just looked at it as something material, not as divinity, not as Lilith, creatrix, cohort of creator coming down into earth. We just look at the earth as a form. I'm not saying this about every person. This is just kind of the Judeo-Christian twist on things. And it's not even true for everybody within the Judeo-Christian twist on things, but that's kind of the dominant awareness right now, that we are not walking on a holy being through holy consciousness, but we're just walking on earth. So Lilith is here is to kind of reactivate, reawaken our reconnection to the divinity of this material form of the earth.
Well, wow, that's quite the story, huh?
Yeah, it is a story. It's really quite vast. I could go for hours about.
Oh, sure.
And
I know you gave us the Reader's Digest abridged version, but wow, even that, it just gives a lot to think about, a lot to chew on.
Yeah, it's worth, she's a goddess who's worth a second look. I mean, most goddesses are, but if you find a goddess who has a very dark story around her, she might be worth a second look. There might be another story behind that shadowed.
Right.
I don't want to use the word dark. I say dark, but we'll just say shadowed. It's, you know, it's called dark because she arrives out of the underworld, and she arrives out of places. She generally holds dominion over places that don't have solar light. So it's dark in terms of the quality of where she exists. So it doesn't have to do with the way, you know, we need more words. We need more words than dark. But
Yes. Sometimes words really fall short.
yeah. You know, otherworldly places of tension, mystery. You know, the goddesses that work with the realms of mystery, the otherworld, death. You know, they're referred to as dark, but really, so they should be referred to properly as, you know, goddesses of death, the mystery, the, you know, the portion of the life cycle that's about recycling and regeneration. It's not about growth. It's about you have to have that aspect, you know, the recycling, the reincarnation, the regenerative. So when I say dark, that's what I'm referring to.
Sure.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, thank you, Caroline. Gosh, I'm. I don't know. You've given us so much information today and so much to think about, and I'm grateful for you for that, because I think we are at a time when really we must rethink everything.
Yeah.
Everything, the entire world as we know it, all of our systems, everything we must rethink.
Yeah.
And as you were referring a few minutes ago to, you know, our ability to survive and continue even existing, I think it really depends on our very ability to rethink and re-look at everything.
Yes. And I think that, you know, re-engaging a mythical perception, because what we're seeing in the physical, the narrative, the sort of collective narrative is really about the physical realm. And we've lost a big portion of understanding that we actually are 99% energy, and we actually are living in a realm that is truly divine, has many, you know, divine beings and interventions of the divine, and we are a part, an aspect of that. And by losing track of that, we are giving away a lot of power and a lot of potential to live in a reality that has more balance and is kind of more holistic, and in relationship to the material and the spiritual. So I'm really grateful to be part of this conversation with you. Thank you so much, because I think that it is time to reawaken the truth of our divinity and the level of divinity that creates all things.
And I think, you know, it doesn't even matter so much what anybody believes at this point, or what anybody really listening to this conversation thinks or feels. What matters really is that we just listen with an open mind and curiosity and open heart, and then we find our truth from all of the information that we gather from you, from all of these speakers on this summit, from everybody we meet, really, because everybody we meet has some message, some pearl, some bit of something to give us and to share with us. And I think when we can start sitting down and having these conversations and openly exploring and saying, "Hey, Caroline, what do you know?" And, "Oh, wow, well, how did that work? And what does that mean?" And we start to just really question and just be open and look at things with curiosity and openness. Then I think we can begin to shift into whatever it is that we really truly are, and we can sort of lose the constraints of all of the trappings of the world. I mean, the senses are wonderful and we need them, and I'm grateful that we have them, but they can also make things get very sticky.
Well, you know what's lovely about the goddess in terms of working with the goddess versus one God, with when there's one God that's divine and everything else beneath it is messy. When you're working with goddesses, the goddesses are, and there are gods too. I mean, if you look at the Greek myths, there's a lot of mythology with, pantheons of very complicated Nordic myths, very complicated male and female goddesses. But to return to a sort of a pantheon of deities, the goddess is, many goddesses have, flawed, real, edgy, sticky elements.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a way of connecting for us to be able to recognize that, well, if a goddess is complicated, sticky, and, maybe I can be too. And that is part of the divine path here. We are on evolution, a very sticky evolutionary path. And the goddess is willing to meet you. Jesus will meet you in your sticky places. God may also, but the goddess most certainly, well, not all goddesses, but there are definitely a lot of goddesses that will meet you in the holiness of that sticky nature, of that sticky, edgy, nature. And that's what's different than having a god out there versus having a goddess that's embodied and living within, the human realm, the messy human realm, and helping us get through it, because the feminine is messy. We bleed, we have babies, we clean up babies' poop, we're growing food, we do a lot of compost, we're cleaning the house. It's a very messy process to be human, but the goddess meets us in those places. It's not a deity that's out there waiting for us to arrive with our perfect consciousness. It's a force of the feminine that's willing to work with you here, and support you here. So I love that, all the movements that are kind of recognizing that this is a concept to how do we engage with the goddess, And
something that I really like that you just mentioned, like the goddess aspect is very messy because, we bleed and we have babies and we clean up poop and all of that stuff, because something that I've recently become very aware of in my own life, in my own self, is as I have been questioning, what is this inner goddess thing? And what is this divine feminine? And I mean, I'm a yoga teacher. And so that, of course, introduced me to some, ideas that I did not hear about in my upbringing. And as I've been digging into it and trying to figure out what it even means to me, I've realized when I feel the most connected to the divine aspect of myself or anything else is when I am doing the really dirty work.
Mm.
We think of the goddess as being, the adorned and the jewels and the da 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 da. But I really have found that when I am dealing with the really difficult stuff, the really messy things in life, and I'm having to draw on this inner strength to get me through, that is when I am the most in my divine aspect. That is when I feel the most connected to divine energy. So I'm glad that you brought that up.
That's gorgeous. It's really helpful that the goddess, there are goddesses that love, that are, they're involved with humanity. They're very familiar with what messy looks like. And this is why it's lovely to have a relationship with a goddess. So when you're deep in that messiness, to get a little support, get a little help from the other side. If not just a resonance of peace, but it sounds like even though you might not know, or maybe you do know who the goddess is that's supporting you, the fact that you feel your sort of resonance, your own frequency, your own divine frequency when you're in these really dark and sticky places, that is actually the place where we meet the goddess, in those places of our own higher frequency. The goddesses are not above us. They're looking to meet us in our, cultivating of our higher frequency. That is what they're curious about. And that's where they want to meet. And they want to see us do the hard work of finding our own divine frequency. So it's beautiful and no surprise that you are doing this whole thing, a whole portal about the goddess, because you have the frequency of knowing that in yourself. You recognize when that shows up. It's really beautiful.
Thank you. Well, Caroline, thank you so much for so many beautiful thoughts and concepts and stories and art and so much beautiful sharing.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. It's been lovely. It's such an honor, and much love. May we all be held by the great divine forces that are embedded in all things, in every breath, in every movement, in every moment.
And if anyone wants to find you, is there a way you would like them to do that?
I have a website with my name, Caroline Seconder, a shop that's sometimes open. I work on garden timing. It's not always open. It's open sometimes, not always.
I love that. I work on
garden time, the
That's
earth doesn't produce 24 hours, 365 days. So, but I'm there, and I have an Instagram with social media. Sometimes I do transmissions and ideas and things about the goddess, and different goddesses are contracting me, commissioning me, more things come and go. So may each of you who are in the field be blessed by the goddess within and the goddess without.
Thank you so much, Caroline.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Bonnie.
Thank you to all our viewers for your curiosity and your open minds and